Welcome, everyone. If you are here today, you are in for such a great experience. This is the first of the Wisconsin Green Schools Network, soon to be known as Field Ed Ventures Lunch and Learn series. Today, our guest is Joe Riederer. Joe has been a collaborator with us on a number of projects, and among the collaborations, Joe is making restorations in the Barrens available as a free download, a free ebook on the EEC website. So some of you may have gotten your own copy, and if you're like me, I have a hard copy, which I keep a close eye on, but I promote it all the time. It looks like this. So we're very fortunate to have Joe here as a collaborator. Joe is a longtime educator working as a middle school science teacher in Wisconsin Rapids. He's the author of 2 novels and numerous articles about teaching students in natural environments. Today we're going to talk with Joe about his book, Restoration in the Barrens, and we'll be sure to open up the conversation to students and other participants. So welcome to Joe, and thank you for being here today and for making restorations in the Barrens available to readers. Happy May Day to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. This is the highlight of my month. I'm really excited and looking forward to hearing from people.
All right. Well, Joe, I confess that when I think of people that work in science fields and the type of writing that they do, I often think about field notes and lab reports and informational articles. So when I heard that you had the book Restoration in the Barrens, and then I started reading it, I was really interested in the science content that's coming out through Corey, the main character, through his thinking and dialogue. But then I really became very excited and interested in the story. I really got to like Corey, and I don't know if like the other kids, if you've heard the story, and the whole cast of characters that you created. And I'm wondering, what was it that led you to write this story?
Good question, and it has a variety of answers. Many years ago, I worked at the same middle school I work at now, but we taught a unit on prairies, and the English teacher was always looking for a novel that they could read that would incorporate in with our lessons in math and science and social studies. Every novel we could find about prairies involved covered wagons. And everyone kind of got the idea that, well, if you're talking about prairies, you're thinking about things that happened long ago. At the time, I had been real active doing small-scale prairie restorations and had a few other experiences in prairies and pine barrens. And everything all came together, along with having a summer workshop that I attended, and with a lot of downtime and a computer. So it gave me an opportunity to take what I was thinking and start to put it down onto paper.
Excellent. And you're talking about restoration, and I notice restoration is part of the title of this book. And I noticed from reading your book, you kind of like to play with language and play with words a lot. So the restoration, can you tell us a little bit about what you mean when you say a prairie restoration?
All right. Prairie restoration. Prairies are one of the most endangered ecosystems on Earth, grasslands. We learn an awful lot about rainforests and coral reefs, and they're really important. But my kids don't have rainforests or coral reefs in their backyard. But we do have prairie. You can drive along the countryside, and just by noticing which plants are blossoming along a railroad track, you can kind of get a sense that there is a little bit of a remnant prairie there. So a prairie restoration is trying to rebuild as best we can an ecosystem, finding those plants that used to be there and trying to bring them back.
So your main character, Corey, So, I've heard all along. I have another friend who's an author, a former police officer, and he's writing books about um, a former police officer, retired police officer. He knows that's a life and the work that he knows, and he's bringing it to life in his stories. So, I find it interesting that you as an author too are writing about things that you know about. Um, so how much of the story of restoration in the Barrens like is drawn from like your personal life and experience with students, and you talked about the prairie restoration.
Bits and pieces are pulled directly out of my life. At the time I wrote the story, my parents were both very much alive, um, and so I wasn't coming at it from that angle. But you will find people who know me when they read through either one of the novels will be able to say, "Yeah, I know exactly where that came from." And then the game is always, "Is that me or is that me?" They want to know who I'm writing about. Um, but it it incorporates the things I care about and the landscapes I care about. And if I have an opportunity to maybe highlight something that makes someone aware of something, that's a bonus.
All right. So, in this book, Corey is very much part of there's an area called the Barrens, and that's a place where he's doing some habitat work. He's very involved in it, and without giving away too much of the story for those who haven't read it, that becomes a very important place to him. So that place, the Barrens, does that specific place have significance to you, or have you taken middle school students to this location? I was just curious about that selection of place.
Sure. Uh, well, quick backstory. When I was in college, I worked for the DNR at a summer camp in northern Wisconsin, up in Minot, Wisconsin. And my job with the high school students that I had as campers was to go out and do service projects for the DNR. Because I was the youngest or the last staff member to get hired, I got the absolute worst job assignment. I got stuck in a place called the Namakagon Barrens. And if you go out into the Namakagon Barrens for the first time, you look around and you say, "What happened here?" Because it's sunny. There's a tree. Our job was to cut them down. It was awful, hard, difficult work until you start to spend some time there, and then you start to notice the changes in the landscape and the little adventures. And you also realize that there are no mosquitoes, so that was a bonus. So I kind of, after a couple of years of working in the Barrens, in the Namakagon Barrens, uh, I actually, one thing that happened right away is that got me to change my college career. I went into teaching immediately after because of that experience. But from there, I spent a lot of time in central Wisconsin. If you're familiar with central Wisconsin, it's kind of flat, kind of sandy. Um, sandy. Um, there's a place called the Buena Vista Grasslands. And in college, we used to go to the Buena Vista Grasslands to do a variety of things, crane counts and things like that. And anytime I was down there in college, I would step out and it would just be so open, you could see forever. And I thought, someday I want to live in a place like that. Well, I live 5 miles from there right now. So it has become the whole Barrens landscape and the ecosystem has kind of become a pretty important part of me.
And it sounds like you by going to these places time after time that you've seen changes in yourself, having that connection to that place, and noticing more over time and just becoming more grounded and aware. It sounds like that was a big change force in your life, is your time spent there, with students. um, Corey in the book has some changes happening. It's called the play on words is the restoration. You alluded earlier to the fact that Corey has a very significant, horrific life change right at the beginning of the book. It kicks off one of the problems in the book and sets the whole story in motion. So that restoration in the Barrens, like you're restoring habitat, Corey's part of that. But then there's perhaps some personal restoration that's happening for Corey as well as a result.
Absolutely. I don't know how much spoiler you want to provide here, but
Not a whole lot more than
okay, we'll just leave it at that. Restoration can mean a lot of things.
right. So when you think about why this place is important, have you had kids, like students that we have online right now, when you've taken them to places like the Buena Vista, I forgot that wildlife area.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things like you've seen as a teacher, and have you brought those into how Corey's behaving in the story as well?
Well, we did on occasion take busloads of kids out to the Buena Vista. And because we're classroom teachers and everyone sits in nice rows, we had all of this highly organized assignments and tasks that we needed to do out in the Buena Vista. And we quickly realized that we just needed to let the kids be kids. And they created their own adventure. And we had to drag them back onto the bus because they were having so much fun. And they had never been any place like that before, and yet it's in their backyard. So that spirit of adventure and discovery is what I try to bring into the classroom. But I know that a lot of my colleagues do also. And it doesn't have to be the Barrens. It doesn't matter what the place is, but place becomes pretty important.
So maybe some of the students that are reading this are thinking about, oh, Corey has this place, and thinking about what's in their backyard or right near their school. So for example, I live right at the edge of the Rat River Marsh, and right outside of, the edge of my yard is a cattail marsh. And I think about, from reading books like Restoration in the Barrens and spending time in nature, I come to look at this place as being really special. And I'm wondering if some of our students out there are kind of, connecting also with Corey and his place and perhaps their own. Maybe students have like an anecdote or something that they really enjoy or have a question. This seems like a good time for us to reach out to some of the students online. Do we have any questions? I noticed Drew had a comment that they're already on chapter 15. So they're getting into the thick of the story here. Drew, I'm wondering if Drew, do you want to comment on what you're thinking so far about the book, or do you have anything you'd like to say if you unmute yourself? Or if Emma were to unmute you, do you have anything you'd like to share? I'll give Drew just a little wait time. Sometimes it takes a bit. Oh, he's good. Okay, so that I take that to mean you don't want to go on right now. So Victoria, you had something you wanted to ask or share.
Yeah, Sandy, we had a question submitted that was a question for Joe, specifically about teaching about the book. Is that something we want to do now, or are we going to talk a little bit more about teaching about the book later?
Well, no, this is a perfect opportunity. So
the question comes from Harley, and the question is, are there any tips or suggestions on covering the romance scenes in the book with students?
I have not taught the book. In the team that I was on, the English teacher taught the book, and it's never really been an issue in the 7th grade. If you were a 5th grader, maybe a 6th grader, that whole going out together thing sometimes doesn't quite carry the same weight because it's a few years in the future. But I would teach it as sometimes we do embarrassing things. Sometimes things don't always go the way you'd like. And I won't spoil it and explain what the embarrassing thing that happens in the story is, but sometimes embarrassing things happen and we rise above them.
Right. Do we have any other questions? Anyone from WGSN Field Adventures have questions? So, Harley, thank you for bringing that question up, because it's like you're almost like a plant, because you lead me to the next thing that I had wanted to ask Joe. So thanks for making my job here a little easier. So when I'm thinking about Corey and I meet him, and every time I pick up the book, I'm like, oh, I want to check in and see how Corey's doing. He's become like a friend to me. And I always feel like an author's been very successful when you care that much about a character. And I don't know if some of the students and the teachers on are like thinking that same thing, but he feels like a real adolescent to me. And he's got the real pressure. So like the pressure for romance, and even the pressure sometimes to appear a certain way in front of your peers, your fellow students, where I think there was a scene or a segment of the story where Corey's delivering a presentation, and how we all feel nervous about those kinds of things, and that's natural. Like how to be true to yourself in those situations. Can you talk about, beyond the romance part of it, like how did you make this character real, and how did you make him come to life like you have in the pages?
Corey is an amalgam of kids that I've known and myself and things that I wish I was. And he goes through challenges that just about all middle school kids will go through. The specifics may be different, but if you talk to any middle school student, one of their big concerns is trying to fit in and not letting anyone know that they think differently about something. And if you have been around middle school students lately, everyone carries the same water bottle, or if you're wearing the wrong shoes, you're not quite as cool as the people who wear the correct shoes. And fitting in is an issue, and particularly if your concern is critters out in the middle of a wildlife area that everyone thinks is wasteland, that makes you a weirdo. And the idea here is that everyone in one way or another is a little different, and some people just hide it better than others.
And I think you do a good job with like one of the friends. It becomes revealed, that the whole idea that we all have our little quirks, and I think you do a good job of showing that difference, that each of us kind of carries some unique qualities. So just let me say that. A question just popped in, and this was from Vanessa. Vanessa, would you like to be unmuted and ask your question directly? Okay, Vanessa, here she is.
I wanted to ask, where did you come up with those names?
The names for the characters?
Yes.
All right, great question. Thank you. If you were to hop onto Google and search those names, particularly their last names, you're going to find that most of those are related to prairie plants and animals. Mr. Culex, the evil science teacher. Well, Culex is a type of mosquito, one of my least favorite critters, and yet I know they're important. And Miss Osseo. Osseo was a part of the scientific name for owls. I like owls. I like that character. So some of those were there because I wanted to try to sneak in a little secret about the animals that live in the prairie. Also, if you use those names, then no one will come to me later and say, "Oh, I see you used my name." So little way for me to maybe disguise who I'm actually writing about. But thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for reading the book.
So, Joe, was it difficult being a science teacher to have Mr. Culex be that evil science teacher? Like, what motivated you to make the science teacher of all people this kind of, what would you call him, annoying, buzzing fellow here in the school?
Well, again, I took characteristics of teachers that I've had. No one I work with now, let me put that out there. No one I work with now, they're all awesome. And quite honestly, sometimes me on a bad day. We don't all, we're not all perfect. And I took all of the characteristics of those people that I don't like, those characteristics I don't like. It's not that I don't like the people. And I wanted to kind of put them all into one, evil villain character. And Mr. Culex fits the bill.
And I noticed that you've got Mr. Culex, and then there's like the polar opposite teacher in the character of Mrs. Conley. There are other teachers like he interacts with frequently, and they have a variety of traits that kind of or positions that match the names that you've given them, perhaps. But can you talk about the intentionality, or did that just organically happen, or did you kind of set up, I've got this character who's really mostly bad, and then I've got this other one who's mostly like sunshine and light?
It was somewhat intentional. In the story, one of the places of refuge in the classroom, or in the building, would be in the library, a place where Corey feels somewhat secure. And if you've gotten to that part, there's a librarian that's kind of watching out for him. Also, in a math class, he starts the day in a math class with a teacher who is strict but fair, and so I wanted to show a diversity of approaches. In fact, in when I was younger, I did 5th or 6th grade. We moved to a new city, and I had to be a new teacher, a new student in a classroom, and that must have stuck with me because I had some teachers who made it as easy as possible, and others who did the evil thing of stand up and tell us all about you. And that must have stuck with me because it found its way into the book.
It sure did. And I, as a longtime teacher myself, I thought like, ooh, I hadn't thought about some of the things that I've done, maybe in from a good place in my heart, but then putting it in the perspective of like how that might have felt to a new kid. And so as a teacher, it was interesting to read the book now as an adult and thinking about how a student might have experienced it. Um, so I think I was jotting a little note on my keyboard here, and hopefully I won't do that anymore, folks, so that I don't give you any more feedback. I think that's the problem that's going on. So one of the things too, when you think about, the thing that 7th and 8th graders are really working on is like the themes in a story, and like the overarching lessons that have been taught. So these characters that you often have, like those archetypes of like the good cop, bad cop sort of thing, good teacher, bad teacher. I noticed that you really built that into your book as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when Corey well, you have a sequel to the book, and that kind of leads me to Titan. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. He wanted to ask you a question about the number of books that you've written, and I know of at least one other, but perhaps you could talk about some of the other writing that you've done.
Sure. So first of all, I wrote Restoration, and then immediately after got to work on Trouble in the Barrens. Picks up where Restoration left off. And then an odd thing happened. Those of you who, if you haven't finished the book, cover your ears. I will tell you that as the result of the work I put into writing Restoration in the Barrens, I started on the lengthy process of adopting a child. And who knew that when you adopt a 6-year-old, it's going to take an awful lot of your time, and you won't have an opportunity to have the quiet to write for a while. So Restoration got published, then Trouble, and I've got lots of notes for the next book. My son is now 26 and is doing fine elsewhere in the Milwaukee area, and now I'm starting to get the itch again to pick up where we left off. Other writings, I've got a series of short stories. They're particularly geared towards classroom teachers, a way to teach a particular lesson in a classroom, and a couple of magazine articles that have found their way. But other than that, mostly it's just kind of trying to figure out how to take this story from Trouble in the Barrens and move it one step further. Just a teaser, Mr. Kulik's is back.
All right. So, and I am doing this from home, and I've got a remote vacuum cleaner that's making some irritating noise in the background. So this gets really real, everybody. And Joe, thank you for your patience too. Hopefully it'll run out of battery, right? So when in the sequel with Trouble in the Barrens, some of the characters that you talk about also come back, and I'm wondering, like, how could there possibly be some trouble in some of these native remnants of prairie or other habitats? I know Corey in this book is working with some experts. What are some of the threats that you see happening to places like the Barrens, which is also known as Mary
G. Lincoln.
Mary G. Lincoln Wildlife Area. So what's going on in our wild areas?
Well, in the story, there are people who have other uses for this wasteland, and those other uses would pretty much destroy the Barrens. uh, in a life follows fiction sort of way. Um, the Buena Vista grasslands that I mentioned before, um, many years ago, uh, a chunk of the Buena Vista grassland was put up for sale, or a part adjacent to it, with the idea of turning it into a variety of things, drag strip, all kinds of uses that would not have been conducive to the critters that live there. So there, every ecosystem um, is kind of always in that tug of war between let's preserve it for the future or let's get some economic gain from it now. People need jobs. I get that. But people also need wildlife.
Right. And one of the things that I kind of noticed too is when you're talking about the area with the central pivot irrigation systems and like water usage and all, those developments, you sort of hinted at that in the book. And that's even gotten to be a larger concern in central Wisconsin, for
Yes.
example. So students might be kind of interested in following some of that as well. So if you're, now you became interested in writing, you probably wrote professionally first, more science-based things before switching over to novels, or have you always been kind of playing around with writing? Like, take us into like your interest in writing.
So I used to do a lot of writing and would never show anyone what I wrote. And I think if anyone's looking for how to get started in writing, the answer is to write. Just put things down on paper. And I had an opportunity to go to school for a semester out east, and through that, I got to work at the Center for Astrophysics at Harvard. It was kind of fun. And part of my work there involved finding ways to get educators more excited about teaching earth science. And I was able to write several articles that got published, and that kind of set the bug in my head. But never would I have considered writing a novel or fiction, because that was what the smart people did, and I wasn't a smart person. I will tell you that there are high school teachers who would be rather surprised, high school teachers that I've had, who would not have in their life imagined, first of all, that I would have become a teacher, and second, that I knew how to write a sentence, let alone a book. So there's hope for all of us. But I started slowly with no intention whatsoever of doing anything except sharing the story I was putting together with a few friends, and then it just built from there. And 200 or 300 edits later, and I was able to get it published.
Wow. So it was quite the process and the journey. And, I hear this a lot from authors. They talk about like, no, I wasn't the writer in school. And that wasn't my thing. And nobody necessarily had, pushed you toward that. And it's sometimes funny how our paths and our journeys in life get us to the place we're at. So you had suggested that students just write, and like you did, maybe start out writing for yourselves and others. Do you have other suggestions, or do some of our listeners and participants, do you have questions about writing? Maybe you kind of have that little itch to do some writing yourself, and now you've got a published author on the line here. What questions do you have for Joe about writing? do any of our field adventures team, do you have questions? Oh, so Titan is actually writing a small story.
Awesome.
Titan, would you care to talk about it a little bit? Maybe like who your character is and the setting, and the problem of the story?
Not officially done yet, so but I can tell you what the main character's name is. The two main characters' names are John and Jasmine. And it's basically like a romance slash school related story.
All right.
Awesome.
Oh, Sherry, we have a question. Titan, do you have the problem in mind, and or the problems your character is going to get into?
Yeah, I actually do have a problem that I'm thinking about for him to get into.
Okay.
I'm thinking he's probably gonna get in trouble with the principal or something about like that.
All right. And that is something that definitely your readers would find very relatable, right? With our, we tend to want to avoid trouble, especially with those in authority, like the principals. Titan, Joe, do you have any encouragement for Titan as he goes forward?
Just keep writing. Don't let anyone tell you you're doing it wrong. However, always look for editors. Anytime I write something, I have a series of people. I know who's going to see it first and second, and I know that the very last person who's not even going to have any idea what it is, that person, when she edits it, has no idea what it's about, and that's the headspace I need her in, so that if there's a mistake, if there's an error, it just shows up really easily. I will tell you that you're going to get to the point where you can't edit your own work. Your brain's going to, if something's missing, your brain's going to fill in the detail. Make sure you save somebody who's never read your story so that they can read it. And then if there's something missing, it'll show up for them where it won't show up for you because your brain already knows what the correct answer is.
Okay.
That's great advice. We had a question from Mr. McKean, who is asking, was it hard for you to find a publisher and to get your book out there and to promote it?
Yes. And here's how it worked. I put it out to everybody and their uncle. It's kind of a challenge for someone starting out. Most editors won't look at your work unless you have an agent, and agents won't look at your work unless you've been published. So breaking in is difficult, and for me, it turned out to be kind of impossible. I got lots of rejections. The ones I really appreciated were the ones that came back smelling like cigarettes. I know that somebody took the time, and unfortunately smoking cigarettes, but they took the time to read through it. I know at least that they read it. There was a moment, a couple of weeks of excitement when Simon & Schuster sent me a letter saying, "We want it, we'll take it." And I hadn't heard anything for a while, got a letter back from them, and it said, "We have gone through some changes and we no longer, are interested in your book." It was at that point that I took all my rejection letters and quite literally lined the bottom of my chicken coop with them and took out a second mortgage on my house. Big Blue Stem Press is me. I created the company and learned how to run a small business, and it it worked out. I took a risk and it worked. I'll leave it at that.
That's wonderful. And that's a great story of how to persevere through, you know, don't accept no. If you have a passion and a dream, keep pursuing it. We have another question about your process of writing. So in education, particularly in English language arts classes, we might require our students to go through different processes, and often as a teacher we find out that's not what published authors always do. So what is your approach? Do you make notes and like make the graphic organizers? How do you do it?
Okay. The first book, I knew how it was going to start. I knew how it was going to end. And then I knew some of the adventures and issues we had to have in the middle. So if I know where point A is and point B is, I need to somehow get from point A to point B. And I would get stuck on, this doesn't make sense. And then I would wake up in the middle of the night and say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Or on a long drive, I would sometimes have a notebook, and don't tell anyone I did this, but I would drive with one hand and write with another hand. Who knew there were these things called phones you could speak into and record? That was new to me. But anyway, so the process always, when I start, I always kind of know how I want things to end. I know where I want the character to get to. I know where they start, and it's navigating that space in between is sometimes a struggle, and sometimes really, really weird things happen. On many occasions with the first book, I would be sitting down in my basement where my computer was, writing dialogue. And then it just happened. It just, 3 hours later, literally 3 hours later, these people just had a fight or whatever, and I had no idea where it came from. I was just doing the typing, and it just, the characters well enough so that you kind of know what their reaction would be. My job was just to record it and try to spell it right.
And it's interesting too, and I heard you say like you write on a computer, and Corey's opinion of computers in the time this book was written, he's not a big fan.
Not a fan.
So had this story taken place now, in present day, how do you think that would have impacted your character a little bit, or his situations?
I suspect that it would have been difficult for him to avoid computers. They've become so integral into the world. But like several people I know, I'm not a big fan of social media. So maybe if this were happening now, he might completely stay away from things like Snapface or whatever that stuff is. You have to kind of go with the times a little bit.
In the book, Corey, in his thinking, the thought process, when he's not speaking aloud, he's talking about Leopold, a Sand County Almanac, and his connection to his mom. So there was an essay in Aldo Leopold, the Sand County Almanac, and collected essays on the Odyssey, for example, and a couple other references. So what are some of your most influential books that you as an author, you look to? I suspect it might be Sand County Almanac, but are there others as well?
I have a lot of Sand County Almanacs. I, at one point, owned 40 of them. I would go to rummage sales, and I'd spend up to a quarter on a good paperback. But I have Sand County Almanac in audiobook, in tabletop book, and my students, if they were listening right now, would be able to tell you an awful lot about certain months of the almanac that we've gone through. Other influential books, actually, let me expand that to professionals, because I was a big fan of the work well, let's see, Jacques Cousteau was one of my childhood idols, Jane Goodall, and the Hammerstroms. I don't know if you are familiar with the Hammerstroms. They actually did the work out in the Buena Vista that got the state to kind of incorporate that into a wildlife area. So much so, and the Hammerstroms were so important to what I was doing as far as an inspiration. I did get Fran Hammerstrom to do one of my edits. I told you before that we needed to reserve an editor for the end who doesn't know what the book is about, and she graciously was able to do that. To me, that was incredibly important because Fran Hammerstrom was a student of Aldo Leopold.
Wow.
So that got me pumped.
All the connections there. It's so fantastic. So you said that you're working like in your mind, and maybe somewhat down in your computer as well. You've got the next Corey series in the Corey book coming together.
Yes.
Is that the main thing that you're working on, or what else do you have going as a writer?
Well, as far as fiction, that's the big goal. In nonfiction, and it actually dovetails into the fiction a little bit. I'm working on a book or a booklet that helps identify where the critters that we see here all summer, those wonderful birds that are outside my door, where they go in the winter. A bunch of years ago, we had this thing called the polar vortex. Cold, cold, cold school year, the school closed for a couple of days. And I always wondered, well, how did those, how are the deer surviving? Where are the frogs? Where are my bluebirds? And so I've been on a kind of a personal quest to find out as much about each species that I see out here, where they go, how do they survive? And it turns out it's kind of crazy. Some of them migrate, some of them bury themselves in the mud, some of them freeze solid. You can have a frog sickle. It's kind of cool. So that's the nonfiction portion that I'm playing around with, and then Corey has to have an adventure also. So those are the things that I'm working on. Where they come out, when they come out, I don't know.
I hope we'll be one of the first that you share them with.
Possible.
So it's interesting that your writing often comes out of your curiosity, and with the polar vortex, for example. And I know that you're also a photographer. So do you use your photography alongside your writing, or is it an inspiration for your writing, or are those two things living separately?
Oh, no, they are definitely not separate. They are different ways for me to do what I always like to do. I want to take my love of nature and somehow get other people excited about that. And if I can do that through my photography, if I can do that through my writing, and if I can do that through, any video project, anything I can put together, that's what I want to do.
So Joe, this hour has gone by really quickly. We have a few minutes left, and we were wondering if maybe we could open it up for questions. If we unmute everybody, it looks like maybe that's been done, or not quite. Looks like Kenzie has a question. Go ahead, Kenzie. Or am I just seeing names scroll by? Does anyone have a question?
I do. Joe, how did you become interested in prairies?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you. Initially, it was because I ended up in college working at the Namakagon Barrens, the place I told you about before. And a Barrens ecosystem is, think prairie with some trees and shrubs. And in the process, I got to know about prairie plants and prairie animals, an adventure that will be with me forever with my kids up in the Namakagon. Badgers are pretty common here, and they're common up there. I had a van full of high school kids driving down a dirt road, and to call it a road is an exaggeration, just two paths in the sand. And there were two badgers, two baby badgers in the middle of the road in front of us. And I stopped the van and I said, kids, take a look. We're going to sneak up on them at the van, just inch closer and see if we can, see how close we can get a good view of them. And as we got closer and closer, the badger stood up, and I thought, well, they're going to run. They stood up and charged the van. This little animal had the tenacity to go after a Ford Econoline van. And all the kids screamed, and we laughed about it all the way home. And it's those kinds of adventures that just, stay with me forever. That and the fact that there aren't many mosquitoes.
Great question, Vanessa. Other questions or comments from participants?
I had a question for Joe. I actually teach with Harley at Northern Waters. You came to visit us last year maybe and taught that sifter class.
Yep.
And maybe that is actually a good connection if you want to share the sifter stuff. That might connect a little bit to the Barrens and place-based teaching. But I was also wondering if you have a collection of some of the nonfiction articles that you have written that we could take a look at.
I will pull together everything I've got and get it out to Sandy, and she's got some really powerful people who can magically turn it into things that are available online. Yes, I'm talking about you, Emma.
Any other questions?
Joe, this is Victoria. I taught your books in my 7th and 8th grade class starting in 2002 and all the way through that I was teaching. And I'm rereading them again now, and Corey is just as lovable now as he was when I first read them. And I just want to say thank you. It is such an enjoyable story to read and to reread. And even after this lapse of time, going back, just picking up on all of just the amazing nuances in your book are just phenomenal. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
So, Joe, what is your wish as an author? What is it that you hope your readers gain from reading your novels?
I want them to care. If I can create a novel where they care about the characters, then maybe they kind of care about what the characters care about. Mm-hmm. If it were a novel about football, well, then I would hope that they would care about and understand football. In this case, it's a prairie ecosystem, but more general, just the planet we live on.
And with that, that is a great place for us to pause and thank you for this time today and sharing your expertise and your time and your energy and passion for kids and our planet and our earth. And some of the things that are now available, in addition to Restoration in the Barrens, which some of you have started to read, we now through your publishing company have also the ebook for Trouble in the Barrens. So those of you online, you can like kind of do your snaps applause for that. So the story doesn't end for you with restoration in the Barrens. It continues, and it's just as exciting as the first one. Yeah. So that'll be available on our EEK website, which is eekwi.org. So visit that. There's lots of things too where maybe you've heard Joe talk about some of these plants or animal species. There's a good chance you might learn about them on our EEK website. Thank you, Joe, for this great opportunity and for being our first in the Lunch and Learn series, our first guest. Joe, and thank you for the teachers and participants. You've been great. I hope you found this to be a great way to spend an hour of school on Friday from home, right? Or even if it's not a school day, just a great place to be together. Thank you all. Thank you, Joe. On behalf of the Wisconsin Green Schools Network, now becoming Field Adventures, this is Sandy Benton, thanking you for spending this time with us. Have a great rest of your day.